My name is Dr. Abram Allen. I am the eminent surgeon of Salem, New York. I moved here from Sturbridge, Mass. in 1765. I came with my brother Ephraim. We set up an office down on Broadway in Salem, across from the livery stable and the new white church. Some of the local history. In 1799, the Pinckney Treaty was signed, which was our southern border, this country's southern border. In 1803, the Louisiana Purchase was made, which set up our western border. In 1803 also, Salem became an incorporated village. Let's see. The basics of my story start July 31st, 1802. There was a gentleman felling trees in a pasture just east of the village. His name was Isaac Gray. One of the trees came down and a branch winged him. It caught him on the side of the head. Isaac was knocked unconscious and was soon delivered to his home. The doctor was summoned from Rupert, a Dr. Samuel Adams. He came down and visited Isaac and took care of him for 10 days. Isaac showed no improvement. I was called at the 10th day with John Williams, Dr. General John Williams, for consultation. John and I traveled by wagon up to Rupert and visited Isaac. Upon my initial examination, I found that Isaac had a swelling on the back of his head and would need a procedure called trepanning. Now this is a procedure where they drill a small hole in the back of the cranium and release whatever pressure is there and whatever material is there. We consulted with Mrs. Gray, Martha, Isaac's wife, about this procedure. She agreed as long as John did the procedure. So John Williams did the operation that afternoon, and of course I supervised. The next morning we came back to Isaac's home. We found Isaac sitting up in bed, talking and eating breakfast. We thought that was a pretty good improvement over flat on his back unconscious. We redressed the incision and prepared to come back the next day. The second day we returned, Isaac was much the same. He was sitting up, was talking with his wife, he was eating breakfast. On the third day, when we returned to Rupert, Isaac was unconscious and we could not rouse him. Once again, I examined Isaac and found that he had a swelling on his head and would require a second trepanning procedure. Martha decided not to allow us to do this. Subsequently, Isaac died on the 31st of July, and we buried him the next afternoon on the 1st. I knew I was right. I knew I had it right. I had to prove it. So, under cover of darkness that evening, my male colored servant and I went to the burying grounds. Now, my male servant's name was Koofy. Now, Koofy rode in the wagon with me up to the burying grounds. We had a shovel and my bag, and we went to the grave and picked up started to dig the hole. Of course, I had Koofy digging. Now, Koofy would dig everything except for the last foot. He was really superstitious. He figured that Isaac was going to jump up and get him. So I dug the last foot and Koofy hid behind a tree. When I got to the coffin, we opened it up and I removed Isaac's head and returned to the office. At that time, I met with Dr. Alexander McAllister and Dr. Williams and numerous other friends, and we did a post-mortem on Isaac's head. We removed the scalp, opened the skull, and found that there was a large mass on the opposite side of where we had done the first hole. It proved that had I drilled a second hole, that man would have been alive today. So, That's the basics of the story. After we discovered this, we returned Isaac to the cemetery. Koofy and I rode back in the wagon and returned him to his gravesite and reburied Isaac. As is true in Salem today and then, one of the local busybodies saw me in the graveyard. And the village folks lined the streets of Salem for my return. They both cheered and jeered me on my way back to the office. August 2nd, the local sheriff had been notified and I was promptly arrested. A few days later, there was a trial. I was put before the judge where I very proudly professed that yes, I had dug up Isaac Gray, and yes, I had removed his head, and yes, I had proven that a second trepanning would have saved his life. The judge wasn't really amused. He charged me $250. That was the fine. At that point, I gladly paid. It was the best advertising dollar I had ever spent. You may laugh. I became one of the richest doctors in Salem. At that point, there were 4 doctors here and 1 in Rupert, 1 in Shushan. I got patients from all over the county. They would come just to have me work on them. It made me a very, very, very rich man. And that is why Abram Allen is the preeminent physician in Salem, New York. John Clark, who's standing in the back here, and Michelle Hunter Bardwell and her husband recently rediscovered the Abram Allen stones. Abram and his wife and 3 of his children, Ephraim and his wife and 3 of his children are buried just over the crest of the hill.